The world, in that time before time had a name, was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was. A great plain of breathless silence stretched to every horizon. The trees were ancient but unaware. The rivers knew how to flow, but not why. The wind passed, gently over stone and hill, not yet carrying the laughter or sorrow of any living voice. In this quiet, untouched earth, where no footstep had yet pressed into the mud, and no eye had ever opened to see the stars, something stirred. A breath. Not the wind, nor beast, nor rustling leaf, but something more deliberate, more uncertain, something new. He awoke, not from sleep, but from nothingness. The first human. There was no mother's hand, no father's voice, no cradle of arms nor lullaby to guide him into the world. He emerged from the cradle of the earth itself, from the dust and the warmth of the sun-soaked stone, as if the soil had dreamed a dream so deep it took form. His eyes opened, blinking against the golden haze of daylight. His chest rose, then fell, taking in air not yet named. He lay still for a long time, perhaps hours, perhaps years, for time had not yet begun for him. He did not know who he was, nor what he even meant. The words he, me, or I did not yet exist in the world. There was only feeling, the press of earth beneath, the brightness above, the ache in limbs newly formed. And there was loneliness. Though he did not know the word, he felt it keenly as a coldness more biting than any wind, the kind of loneliness not shaped by absence, but by ignorance. He did not know he was alone, only that something was missing, something vast and formless, like a voice waiting to be heard. His first steps were hesitant. He rose on trembling legs, every movement unsure, like a fawn in a world of giants. He stumbled and fell, tasting dirt, then rose again. The earth was firm, but not unfriendly. The grasses bent underfoot, forgiving. The trees, tall and unmoved, stood like silent watchers. And above, oh, above, there stretched the sky, an endless dome of blue pierced with drifting white. He tilted his head, eyes squinting at the brilliance. Something stirred within him, an instinct old as light itself, to reach upward. His arms lifted, fingers curling into the emptiness. But the sky offered no answer. He was small beneath it. The sun passed overhead in its slow, regal arc. Shadows lengthened. The heat softened into dusk, and the first chill crept into the air. He did not understand fear. Not yet. But when the light faded and the sky turned to velvet, spangled with stars, he felt the pressure of the unknown descend upon him. Shapes moved in the night, creatures whose eyes gleamed from the brush, whose calls echoed strange and distant. He did not know what they were. He did not even know what he was, but he understood in some wordless depth that he was separate from them. They belonged to the dark. He did not. He huddled beneath a tree, wrapping his arms around his knees, shivering, though no frost had yet come. The wind whispered through the branches, rustling leaves like voices just out of reach. His eyelids fluttered. He drifted in and out of shallow, dreamless sleep, stirred by every cry of the night. There were no dreams yet. Dreams required memories, and he had none, only beginnings. And in that long first night, something grew within him, an ember of seeking, the first question, not shaped in language, not even fully formed, but present like a star just below the horizon. What am I? He would not find the answer that night, nor the next, but it had begun. Morning came slowly. The birds, those light-hearted creatures who knew how to sing without knowing sorrow, began to call through the canopy. He listened. Their sound moved something in him. Not joy, not quite, but a flicker of yearning. If sound could be so beautiful, could it also be shared? He mimicked one of their calls, softly, awkwardly. The sound was strange in his throat, but It made him feel less like the world had forgotten him. He wandered then, barefoot across hills and valleys, drawn not by direction but by need, warmth, water, motion. He learned the sting of thorns, the taste of berries, the coolness of river stones. The world taught him with gentle indifference. A bruise here, a scratch there. No cruelty, only consequence. Yet he remained unseen. No creature turned toward him with recognition. No gaze met his and held. The world acknowledged him only as another body, not as a being. This too weighed upon him. Though he did not know the word for solitude, it wrapped around his heart like a fog. And then, one evening, while perched atop a knoll watching the sunset spill like honey across the sky, he made a sound, a long, low hum that vibrated in his chest. It was not a bird call, it was not a cry. It was something new, something only he could make, his first song. It was not beautiful, not yet, but it was his. The wind did not respond, the sky did not change, but he felt, heard, if only by himself. And that was the beginning, not of civilization, not of language, but of awareness. The first stirrings of what it meant to be human, not just alive, but conscious. And with it came both wonder and sorrow, for to be conscious in a world without another is to live with a mirror that never reflects, a name that echoes but is never returned, a question without an answer. Still, he walked forward, and the earth, ancient and wide, waited to receive his footprints. Alone before the dawn, each day, the sun rose anew, as if rehearsing the same performance for an audience of one. He, the first human, would awaken with the light creeping over the curve of the hills, his body curled in the hollow of a tree's roots, or against the warmth of a sun-baked stone. And with each morning came the same ritual. He would rise slowly, blinking, stretching sore limbs, brushing dust from skin he still did not understand. There was no voice to greet him, no words, no morning song meant, for his ears alone, only the rustle of wind in the grass and the low murmurs of distant animals. Yet he still listened. Each morning, as the sun kissed the earth, he paused, waiting, hoping, but the silence remained. The sound of no one else was not a quiet one. It was a presence, a heavy blanket draped across every tree, every echo. It followed him into rivers, where his reflection wavered but never spoke. It crouched in the caves he explored, where he left handprints on the walls in soot and mud, trying to make something stay behind, something that would say, "I was here." His ears longed for something, more than the chatter of birds or the howl of beasts. He wanted something like him, something from him. But when he cried out, long and strange across the open fields, no answer came. The hills swallowed his voice. The valleys cradled it, then let it go. He began to hum often, not in melody, but in memory, the memory of the first sound he made, alone atop that knoll. It comforted him in a way food could not. It made the wind feel less empty. But it was not enough. So he began to speak, not in a language anyone would recognize now, not in formed words or phrases. It began with naming. He pointed to the river and made a sound. He did the same for trees, for rocks, for the sky. These names changed often. Sometimes he forgot them. Sometimes he changed them just to feel he could. There was power in that, he sensed. In giving the world labels. It was the beginning of claiming, not in dominance, but in understanding. The world was large, unknowable, but with each sound he gave to a thing, it felt a little more familiar, a little more his, yet for all his naming, there was still no one to hear. One evening, beneath a sky of melting gold and violet, he sat by a stream and spoke aloud for a long time. He did not know what he was saying. There was no grammar to his thoughts. Just sound, made into shape, poured into the air like a cup tipped slowly. He told the water about the stone he had found. He told the stone about the tree that leaned like a crooked finger. He told the tree about the firefly he had followed and how its light blinked like the stars. None of them answered. The stream flowed on. The stone stayed silent. The tree stood still. And for the first time, he felt mocked. He slammed his hand into the water, sending a burst of droplets into the air. They glittered briefly, caught in the sun, then vanished into the soil. The world had heard him, but it had not cared. That night, his sleep was troubled. He tossed among the roots of a low hill, dreams swirling in his mind like fog. Though he still lacked language, he dreamt of shapes. Others like him, sitting around a circle of fire, their mouths moving in ways his did, their eyes looking back at his. He awoke with tears on his face. It was the first time he had ever wept. The act confused him. It hurt, not in his body, but somewhere deeper. The tears came without cause he could name, and yet they cleansed something. They softened the edges of the silence, and they taught him. The body remembers even what the mind has not yet learned. In the days that followed, he sought new sounds. Not those of nature, but those he could make himself. He clapped his hands, together, slapped stones against logs, rubbed sticks until they squeaked. He shouted, growled, whispered. He played with echo, calling into caves and listening for the voice that mimicked him. The echo was the cruelest trick of all. It gave him hope, then took it back. He chased the echo once, convinced it was another. He ran barefoot across sharp stone and thorn, calling again and again. "Ahoo!" he cried, and the world answered, "Ahoo!" But no one came. No one ever came. He fell to his knees at the edge of a ridge, the echo still bouncing behind him, fading like a ghost refusing to say goodbye. Still he listened. He began to differentiate between kinds of silence. The hush of morning fog was different from the stillness after thunder. The silence of caves had a weight to it, while the quiet of open plains felt like light air between stars. He listened so well, so long, that he could tell when a leaf dropped 3 trees away, or when a bird stilled its wings mid-song. He became a master of silence, its unwilling disciple. He could hear the absence of things, and sometimes, just sometimes, that absence whispered back. One dusk, sitting beneath a crescent moon, he felt something stir in the air beside him. Not a sound, but a sense, as though someone had almost spoken, as though a breath had been drawn in just near his shoulder. He turned. There was no one, yet he smiled, because now he was not only naming the world, he was beginning to imagine it, and imagination is the quiet twin of companionship. It was a fragile thing, easily broken by cold or hunger, but he held it close, a flicker of light in the vastness, and so he continued, speaking, humming, listening, for though there was still no one else, he had begun to shape his loneliness into something beautiful, a symphony for a world not yet ready to hear. The days grew longer, or so it seemed to him. The sun rose higher and lingered like an old friend, reluctant to leave. He, the first human, wandered farther now, his bare feet leaving uncertain traces in damp soil, moss, and shifting sand. Wherever he went, he named. Not just objects now, but motions, feelings, patterns in the sky. He had begun to see faces in the rocks, moods in the wind. Not illusions, not hallucinations, but imaginings, gentle ghosts of thought placed where the world gave none. In a gnarled tree he saw a hunched old figure. In a curling wave, the tale of a creature long forgotten by waters that had never remembered. When the sun dipped low, casting its golden fire across the land, the shadows came, and the shadows moved. At first, they frightened him. They grew tall and stretched long across the land, mimicking his every movement, but with eerie silence. When he ran, they followed. When he stopped, they halted. When he raised his hand, they did too. Delayed, dark, voiceless. Were they mocking him or joining him? He chased them across the hills, down the valley ridges. Sometimes he turned fast enough to catch one in mid-move, convinced he would catch it unaware. But always it matched him, shape for shape. It did not breathe. It did not blink. Yet it knew him, so he gave it a name, his shadow. A soft curling sound, different from the others, meant not for a tree or bird, but for a part of himself he could not touch. It gave him a small sense of power to name the thing that followed him everywhere. In that naming, something else stirred, the idea of sameness. If the shadow was shaped like him, moved like him, yet was not him, could there be others, not of shadow, but of flesh? Was there a twin somewhere, a figure who moved without mimicry? He looked often toward distant ridges, hoping to see movement not echoed by his own. He saw none. Still, the thought took root, the longing deepened, and so he turned his gaze upward. The stars became his new companions. At night, after the wind had calmed and the creatures of the wild settled into their nocturnal rhythms, he would lie back on warm stone or moss, eyes wide, breath slow, and watch the sky unfold. It was never silent up there, not truly. Though sound did not reach him, he imagined a quiet hum, a chorus of glowing watchers spinning in patterns too large for him to grasp. He gave them names. The brightest one, which rose just after dusk and stayed until moonrise, he called the Eye. It felt as though it watched him gently, not unkindly, from the edges of darkness. A cluster that looked like a curved line, he named the Curve of the Hunter, though he did not yet know what hunting meant beyond hunger. A trailing line of faint. Stars was the tail, which he imagined belonged to a beast too vast to walk the earth. Some nights he spoke to them, not to be answered, but to be heard. He told the stars about the river's bend, about the stone that shimmered red when wet. He told them of the bird that returned each morning to the same branch, and of the scent that rose from grass after rain. He began to give his feelings names, too. A soft ache in his chest when he saw the moon reflected in water. He named that. The sting behind his eyes when the sun set too quickly. He named that too. His world was becoming filled with meanings, even if only he could hold them. And in naming, he made magic. Not magic of spells or illusions, but the deeper kind. The kind that shapes reality. A rock is just a rock. But a rock named becomes a marker, a memory, a place. It becomes a part of the story. And so he built stories from stones and sky, even without knowing what a story was. Sometimes, when the night was warm and the fireflies blinked gently in the underbrush, he would stand, tall upon a hill, and speak as if to an audience. His arms would rise, his voice would deepen. He would point to the stars he had named and recount their deeds, not because they had them, but because he had given them. He imagined the Eye was once a creature of light that flew too close to the mountain and was cursed to watch the world forever. He told of the tail, which dragged behind a celestial deer fleeing across the heavens. His stories were clumsy, incomplete, but they were his. And in speaking them, he became less alone. For loneliness is not the absence of bodies, but of shared meaning. The first human had no others to hear him, but by giving the world meaning, he echoed himself forward. Each word, each sound, each invented myth was a seed cast into the wind, and he believed that one day something would grow from them. One night, as he stared into the ink-black sky, he saw something new, a streak of fire. It blazed across the heavens for only a breath, white-hot and silent. A falling star. He leapt to his feet, heart pounding, for, the first time, something in the sky had moved without his touch. It had changed, acted. It was not fixed like the others, but wild, alive. He fell to his knees, tears returning, not of sadness, but awe. And then he whispered, to no one but the night, "You can fall too." That night he dreamt, not of loneliness, but of others like him, scattered across the land, each staring up at the sky, each naming stars he could not see. He awoke smiling. For even if he never met them, even if they never existed, he had begun to believe in the possibility of others. And belief, he realized, was the first fire. There came a day when warmth betrayed him. Until then, the world had seemed indifferent but not hostile. The sun offered light without demand. The earth gave roots and fruit, though sparingly. The rivers quenched thirst, and the trees shaded him. Even the night, with its long silences, had never struck at him, only wrapped him in a quiet he had slowly learned to endure. But one evening, he met fire. It began innocently, as many ancient things do. The sky, troubled with strange clouds, had turned bronze in the late afternoon. A tension pulsed in the air. Leaves quivered on still branches. Birds fled their roosts, silent and urgent. The first human stood beneath this sky, staring up, a familiar stirring in his chest, curiosity tinged with unease, and then lightning. A great silver vein split the heavens, followed by a shuddering roar that rolled across the hills. He stumbled backward, breath caught. It was unlike anything he had known, a violence from above, thunder, raw and merciless. He cried out instinctively, but the sky gave no response. Rain followed, sudden and savage. Sheets of water fell, drenching him, pelting the ground until even the stones wept. He crouched beneath a ledge, trembling, not from cold, but from wonder. This was not the gentle drizzle he had seen before. This was anger, and in the midst of this storm, it happened. A tree, tall and ancient, stood proudly upon a distant slope. Lightning struck it without warning, an explosion of light and sound. The trunk split with a shriek, bark flying like shrapnel, and then, from the broken wound, came fire. At first, it seemed a trick. A living thing made of light and hunger, twisting in place, devouring wood with tongues of gold and red. It hissed, it cracked, it breathed. The fire was not like the sun, calm and remote, but wild and near. It danced. He watched, transfixed, from afar. The rain slowed, but the fire endured, licking upward as though taunting the storm. He did not run. Something within him, deeper than fear, urged him forward. Slowly, he climbed the slope, feet slipping on wet grass, until he stood just beyond the heat. It mesmerized him. The fire moved with rhythm, yet without pattern. It pulsed. It spoke in a language of pop and hiss, and in its light, the tree became a skeleton, blackened bones glowing from within. He reached a hand toward it, feeling the warmth kiss his skin, hesitant and inviting. But he reached too far. Pain. It struck like a snake, swift, invisible, and sharp. His fingers recoiled, skin seared, the flesh red and angry. He screamed, stumbling, backward, falling into damp earth. His voice was raw with betrayal. The fire, unfazed, continued its feast. He crawled away, cradling his hand, heart pounding. The warmth he had welcomed had wounded him. The light he had loved had turned cruel. He watched from the shadows, confusion mounting. Why had it hurt him? Everything before had allowed him to touch, to taste, to shape. But not this. Fire did not want to be held. It did not yield to him. It rejected him. That night, he did not sleep. He sat beneath a canopy of dripping leaves, staring at the distant glow where the fire still danced. And he wept, not just from pain, but from realization. Not all beauty was meant for closeness. When dawn came, the fire was gone. Smoke curled from the stump, a ghost rising slowly. Ash blanketed the ground like snow. The tree was dead. He approached, cautiously. The once proud trunk had collapsed inward, blackened and cracked. Embers still smouldered. He prodded one with a stick, watching it flare briefly, then dim. Even in its death, the fire resisted him. But he did not turn away. Over days, he returned to the site again and again. He watched how the fire had changed the wood, how it left behind black, brittle forms. He touched them carefully now, respecting the memory of heat. In time, he discovered that even the ashes had value. They marked his skin, left streaks he could draw with. He painted on stone walls, tracing spirals and suns, silhouettes of trees, the shape of a hand. He began to carry scorched sticks with him, not for warmth, but for memory. And eventually, through accident or persistence, he brought fire back. It was a slow and clumsy discovery. A broken branch dragged against dry bark. A spark caught in dry grass. A breath too strong snuffed it out. A breath too soft left it cold. But he tried again and again, until one evening, nestled in a ring of stones, a flame rose where none had been. This time, it did not strike. It shimmered, small and shy. He fed it carefully. Twigs, leaves, gentle encouragement. It flickered to life. He sat beside it for hours, speaking softly to it, as though coaxing a wild animal. And the fire listened. It warmed his skin. It lit the dark. It stayed. But he never forgot the scar on his hand. Nor did he forget the tree that fell. Fire was not a companion. It was a force, one that demanded respect, distance, and understanding. In the flame's glow, he saw his shadow again, dancing on the stone walls. And now, the shadow moved not just with him, but with the fire too. It pulsed and grew, wavered and swayed. The fire gave his shadow a second life. And that night, beneath a sky of coals and ash, he named the flame. He did not know what the name meant, but he whispered it with reverence. Not as a friend, not as an enemy, but as something holy. The fire had forgotten him once, burned him, denied him, but in its return, in its warmth and danger, he found a teacher. And from that night forward, he was no longer just the first human. He was the first keeper of fire. Before he had names for things like sorrow or time, before he could recount a day from memory or dream, a shape into the future, there was hunger. It came not as a sudden visitor, but as an ever-present shadow. It arrived each morning before his eyes opened, a hollow throb deep in his belly that stretched with him as he rose. It was not pain, not yet. It was a whisper, a pull, a reminder that something must be found, or something within would begin to fade. He lived by his stomach's clock. When the ache grew sharper, he wandered. When it quieted, he rested. There was no choice in the matter. Hunger shaped his hours, his path, even the thoughts that passed across his mind like drifting smoke. At first, food had been simple. Berries along the stream's edge, roots loosened from soft earth, sweet nectar licked from broken bark. These had been gifts of the land, small, fleeting, but familiar. He had learned which colours brought bitterness, which shapes warned of fire in the mouth. He had spat out poison with tears running down his face and learned not to return. But those offerings grew scarce. The trees bore fruit only sometimes. The bushes grew thorns as easily as they grew sweetness. And the cold days came, slow and creeping, where the sun lingered less and the ground grew stingy. That was when hunger ceased being a whisper. It became a god, not one with form or voice, but one he obeyed without question. A god that lived inside him, coiled and ever demanding. It drove him farther from his resting places, deeper into the wild places, where strange creatures stirred in the underbrush, and the wind spoke with teeth. He became lean, his ribs pressed gently against skin. His limbs moved with purpose and urgency. His eyes sharpened, tracking movement, measuring risk. When he found eggs nestled in a hollow, he took them, licking the shell with reverence before biting in. When he stumbled upon a fallen bird, still and stiff, he pressed a hand to it, then, heart pounding, tried to eat. The taste of meat was strange, metallic, heavy, but it silenced the god within him, so he returned to it. He learned to watch the deer, their delicate legs like reeds swaying in tall grass. He mimicked their movements, studied their stillness. But he had no claws, no fangs. He could not run like they did. The land had given him no tools, so he made them: a stick, sharpened on stone, a rock, heavy and flat. He did not understand the word for weapon, but he began to know its meaning in his bones. One night, crouched beneath low-hanging branches, he waited near a watering hole. The moonlight silvered the water's surface. The deer approached slowly, unaware. He struck. The blow was clumsy. The creature screamed, high, desperate, and fled, blood trailing behind. He followed, shaking, stumbling through brush and over root. He found it collapsed, breathing in shallow rasps. It looked at him, and in its eyes he saw not confusion or pain, but something deeper: recognition. For a brief moment, they were not hunter and hunted. They were two beings caught in the same spell of survival, both driven by the god of hunger. He knelt beside it, pressed a hand to its side, and waited until its breath stilled. Then, trembling, he began to eat. It was the first time he felt both victory and grief in the same breath. The meat was warm, rich, strange. It filled the emptiness. But his heart beat heavily, confused and unsure. He slept that night not with joy, but with a strange heaviness. The deer had become more than food. It had become memory. From that day, he honored what he took. Before each hunt, he placed a stone beside the fire. Small, smooth, quiet. Afterward, he whispered to it, not knowing why. The ritual soothed something inside him. It told him he was not only taking, he was remembering, and so hunger, once a god, became something else. It became a teacher. It taught patience, how to wait, unmoving, for hours in the brush. It taught resilience, how to keep walking even when legs ached and cold bit. It taught observation, how to follow the trails of scat, the bend of broken grass, the sound of rustling leaves. But, most of all, hunger taught reverence. He began to see the land not just as a place of wandering, but as a giver, a provider that sometimes withheld. He came to know the cycles, the bloom and wither of plants, the return of birds with the warmth, the soft shedding of trees before sleep. In time, he crafted a pouch from hide, carried roots and berries with care, and learned to dry meat in the smoke of his fire. He was still hungry, but now he prepared. He planned. He remembered. He would sit beside the fire, belly full, hands still marked with blood, and stare into the flames. In their flicker, he saw echoes of the deer's eyes. He whispered again, not words but sounds shaped by meaning. Thank you, they might have meant, or perhaps, I remember you. Hunger never left him, but it no longer ruled him. It became a companion, stern, ever-present, but no longer feared. He still chased, still gathered, still listened to its quiet commands. But now, he answered not as a slave, but as a partner. And slowly, the god within him softened. It no longer screamed. It whispered. It reminded him that life was not just about feeding the flesh, but about feeding the story. And in the crackle of firelight, as shadows danced and the stars listened in their silent constellations, the first human began to shape his life not only by what he took, but by what he honored. There is a silence that comes from nature, a hush of wind weaving through long grass, the distant calls of birds trailing into dusk, the rhythmic lapping of water against stone. But there is another silence, deeper and heavier, known only to those who walk alone without memory, without past, and without echo. The first human knew it well. His steps were soft, learned from years of listening to the movement of deer and the stir of predators. His breathing was light. His tread left barely a trace. But no matter how he moved, the land never answered. He would call into a valley, voice trembling with hope, and hear only the wind. He would strike a stone against another, hoping to awaken some sleeping rhythm in the hills, but the rhythm never returned. No echo, no reply, only the sound of one man lost in a world too large. He did not yet understand that his solitude was a kind of first exile, not from a place, but from belonging. He roamed hills and forests like a ghost from the future, leaving signs that meant nothing to the world around him. A pile of stones arranged with care, a stick driven upright into the earth, a swirl drawn in mud with his finger. Each was a message, but no one came to read them. He began to recognize his own trail. Footprints pressed into damp sand, scrapes on tree bark made by his passing. A torn leaf here, a dropped bone there. He started circling back on himself unintentionally, returning to clearings he had forgotten. One day, he came upon the remains of a fire long cold. The ashes were scattered. A ring of stones still stood. His heart leapt, but quickly fell. It had been his fire, made many moons ago. The land was so vast, yet he always returned to himself. He tried to walk farther, to escape his own patterns. West, beyond the river, he named the crooked spine. South, where the trees grew taller and the air thickened with vines. But the deeper he walked, the more the silence grew. The more the trees leaned in, whispering to one another in a language he could not decipher. He began to feel as though he were intruding, not on a place, but on a story he could not read. One night, he climbed to the top of a great boulder that jutted from the earth like the back of some sleeping beast. From that height, the world unfolded in all directions. Rolling hills like waves, endless forest, distant mountains veiled in mist. It was breathtaking, but there was no witness to share it. He opened his mouth to cry out, not in fear or pain, but in wonder. A long, rising sound poured from him, one he had never made before. It was almost like singing, but rawer, a howl born of longing. He listened. No answer, not even an echo from the stone below. The sound had vanished into the sky like smoke. He lay, back against the rock, staring upward as stars emerged, one by one, like slow blinking eyes. He thought of the deer he had killed, of the fire he had cradled, of the stories he whispered to stones. But none of them whispered back. They did not walk beside him. They did not echo. And that was the wound, the absence of return. Even the beasts had one another. Birds flew in pairs, wolves called to their pack. The deer moved in herds, their steps soft but synchronous. Only he walked without echo. There was no rhythm to follow, no call to answer. He began to imagine a second set of footprints beside his, a shape moving just beyond his vision. At night, in the moments before sleep, he would feel the warmth of a presence at his back, imagined, yes, but comforting. A hand reaching for his, just brushing the skin before vanishing. Sometimes he talked to it. He gave it a name. Not like the names he gave stars or rivers, but a quiet sound he kept to himself, said only in the dark. A name for the companion he did not have, the shadow that did not echo. I would listen, he whispered once, curling close to a tree's roots. If you spoke, I would listen. The wind stirred but said nothing. He began crafting figures out of wood and stone, small carvings shaped, with care. Some had arms, some had eyes made from berries or beads of sap. He placed them in circles or perched them on rocks. Once, he made two and placed them side by side, facing the sunset. Then, he sat beside them and waited. Not for them to speak, but for the world to change. It did not. Yet something in him softened, as if, in creating forms that mirrored him, he had pulled a thread of meaning from the silence. They were still, lifeless, but there, not his echo, but his witness. One evening, while crossing a shallow stream, he stepped on a smooth stone and slipped. His leg twisted, and he fell with a cry. Pain bloomed sharp and immediate. He pulled himself to the bank, breath shallow, and curled around the ache. The god of hunger stirred, the cold pressed in, and for the first time in moons, he was afraid. Afraid. He would die and no one would know. No one would find his body or mark the place. No one would remember the man who named the stars and whispered stories to the wind. He lay there a long time, watching the water move, slow and steady, as though time itself did not notice him. And then he sang. A low, broken song, shaped by pain and breath, carried by the current, not for echo, but for remembrance. If the water carried his voice, perhaps the hills would remember, perhaps the birds would carry it. Perhaps the stone he carved yesterday would be found, and it would mean something. The silence would never reply, but he could speak anyway, and maybe that was enough. To walk without echo was not to walk without meaning. He rose again the next day, leg trembling, and walked on, alone, always alone, but no longer unheard. The sky had always seemed vast, generous. It gave light, gave warmth. It stretched without end, from the mountain's crown to the far edge of the river bend. And when the first human was young in the world, before he knew absence, he had loved. The sky, without question, watched its endless transitions, followed the clouds as they rolled across its dome, counted stars like companions he had yet to meet. But time, long and slow like a winding stream, changed how he saw it. The sky no longer felt like a place of possibility. It had become a ceiling of indifference, a dome too high to reach, too far to touch. It watched, but it did not see. It shimmered, but it did not speak. The man had cried into the night countless times, shouted, whispered, even sung. His voice had risen through the trees, spilled over hills, spiraled into the open air with a plea so ancient it had no shape, and yet, silence. No hand descended from the clouds, no voice from the stars, no sign carved in the moonlight. The sky did not answer, not when he offered his first word, not when he made his first fire, not when he wept over the broken body of a fawn he could not save. It had remained silent, stubborn in its refusal to acknowledge him, a canvas of light and dark that bore no reflection of his pain or joy. He began to resent it. That resentment did not come all at once. It crept in like cold seeping into bone, a slow awareness that what he loved did not love back. Still, he returned to it. Each night, he would lie flat upon a patch of moss or rest against the base of a boulder, staring upward until sleep took him. Not because he hoped for an answer, but because he did not know where else to look. One night, the sky was particularly clear. The stars blinked like distant eyes, and the moon, full and silver, hung just above the horizon. He sat cross-legged on a ridge, arms wrapped around his knees, listening to the wind rustle the tall grass. He took a deep breath and tried again, not with words, but with his heart. He closed his eyes and sent out a feeling, not a question, not a demand, just an offering, the memory of laughter he did not yet understand, the ache of hunger, the wonder of firelight, the sorrow of losing things unnamed. He let it go, like smoke rising from a dying ember. The sky gave him stars, beautiful, yes, but unchanging. He opened his eyes and whispered, "Do you see me?" The wind picked up, the grasses shivered, but no voice came. He looked around. The world was sleeping. Even the fireflies had dimmed, and there, beneath the massive hush of night, he felt it more deeply than ever before. That terrible knowing that he could feel so much and still remain invisible. His loneliness was not because there were no others. It was because he knew he was alone. The difference was like a cut reopened. He lay down, staring upward, and began to speak, not to the stars, not to the wind, but to himself. Words he had made, sounds full of emotion that meant nothing to the trees or the sky, but everything to his heart. He recounted his days, the things he had seen, the shapes he had carved. He spoke of rivers and birds, of dreams and echoes. He paused only once to listen. Nothing replied. He smiled bitterly and turned his face away. But as sleep took him, something shifted, not in the sky, but within. He dreamt again. This time, the dream was not of shadows or imaginary companions. It was of himself, standing in a field of still air, surrounded by stone pillars that reached toward the sky. Each pillar was etched with marks, drawings, symbols, things that resembled the scratches he made when bored or the shapes he traced in ash. In the dream, he touched the stone, and it glowed faintly, as if it remembered him. He turned to look at the sky in that dream, and it was filled with patterns, stories he recognized. His stars had become constellations, and each one bore a name, names he had whispered long ago, forgotten even by him. And then he heard a sound, not a voice, not words, but a soft vibration in his bones. The dream ended. He woke at dawn, the grass wet with dew, his limbs stiff. The sky was pale, fresh with light, and for the first time in moons, he did not resent it. He understood something then. The sky does not answer because it does not speak the way he does. It reflects, it holds, it waits. The stars had never promised anything, but they had also never left. He began to think of the sky not as a listener or a god, but as a mirror, one that showed nothing if he did not offer something first. So he built something, a small circle of stones atop the ridge where he often watched the stars. In the center, he placed a flat rock. Upon it, he carved, painfully, slowly, marks that meant something only to him. Spirals, lines, a rough shape that could be a man or a tree. It was not beautiful, but it was offered. And that night, he returned to the circle, sat cross-legged, and whispered again. Not a question this time, a story. And when he was done, he tilted his head back and smiled, not expecting a reply, but grateful to have spoken. The sky gave no answer, but above him, the stars gleamed, unchanged. And that, somehow, was enough. He had long thought of the beasts as distant, mysterious, fragments of the forest, shadows of the field. They appeared and disappeared like passing weather, neither cruel nor kind, simply there. But over time, the first human came to realize something unsettling. They did not fear him, not truly. Birds might flutter from his sudden step. A hare might pause mid-chew and vanish into thicket. But more often than not, the creatures of the earth looked at him not with wariness, but with blank indifference. Their eyes held no recognition, no spark of shared understanding. He was not kin. He was not foe. He was nothing to them. A movement, a sound, a thing. It haunted him more deeply than solitude. One morning, he awoke beside the river's bend, the one he had come to think of as home. Not home, for he returned often, but never stayed. The sun filtered through reeds, casting shifting patterns on the water. A doe drank just across from him, her neck long, her movement graceful. He watched, unmoving, and then she looked up. Their eyes met. She blinked once. No fear, no recognition, just awareness of presence. Then, calmly, she lowered her head and drank again. He whispered to her, a soft murmur of sounds, something between greeting and plea. She did not react. It was as though he were wind or stone, not prey, not predator, not anything. He rose slowly and stepped toward the water's edge. Still she drank. Another step. A branch snapped beneath his heel. She glanced up once more, then turned and walked away, unhurried, untroubled. He stood there a long while, watching the ripples where she had been, his hands clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in ache. He had hoped foolishly that the beasts might be his bridge. They had language, didn't they? He had watched the wolves, how they circled, howled, touched noses. He had seen the birds teach their young to fly. He had listened to the call of owls echoing through the night, to the chatter of monkeys swinging overhead. But when he tried to mimic them, when he howled with the wolves or chirped at the sparrows, they grew silent, watched him, then moved on. He was not of them. He was something else, and they could feel it. One evening, he followed a boar through the underbrush, not to hunt, but to learn. The beast was large, covered in coarse hair, tusks gleaming in twilight. It moved with power and certainty, snuffling the ground, grunting softly to itself. He trailed it for hours, copying its motions, trying to mirror its sound. When he stepped too loudly, it turned and stared. Their eyes met. His wide with curiosity, the boar's with silent calculation. Then it charged. He barely leapt aside. Its tusk scraped his thigh, drawing a line of blood. He fell, panting, heart hammering in his chest as the boar vanished into the brush. He lay on the earth, staring upward, the pain sharp, but the wound shallow. He understood, finally, and with it came grief. They did not see him as one of theirs. Not, even as other, in the way predator sees prey. They saw nothing. To them, he was unfinished, unbelonging. He rose with effort, limped to a nearby stream, and washed the cut. The water stung. He pressed cool leaves to the wound and sat still, listening. All around the forest moved. Creatures rustled, wings beat, eyes watched from branches, but none drew near. He recalled a night months before, when he had sat beneath a tree and watched two foxes play. They had tumbled, chased, barked in soft high yips, and when they caught sight of him, they had simply vanished, as if erased by the wind. He had returned to that spot often, left gifts, berries, feathers, shiny stones, but nothing came of it. In the quiet of that memory, a strange thought came to him. Perhaps it is not they who are missing something. Perhaps it is me. He looked at his hands, scarred, clever, wrong. His face reflected faintly in water, round, curious, too soft, too bare. He did not have fur. He did not have talons or claws. He did not walk on all fours. His eyes sought more than food or shelter. He sought meaning. He was not beast. He was something new. That realization did not bring peace. It brought sorrow. Because what is new is often alone. Still, he watched them. He learned from them. The birds taught him how to weave twigs. The squirrels showed him where to dig for hidden nuts. The foxes revealed how to move quietly. The herons how to strike swiftly. He became a student of their world. And even if they did not see him, even if they never would, he began to carry them within him. He mimicked their calls not to be heard, but to remember. He carved their shapes into bark with stones. He painted their eyes in the soot of fire. He whispered their names into night wind. He honored them in silence, even if they did not return his gaze. And slowly, gently, he made peace with their indifference. Not every voice is meant to be answered. Some are meant simply to observe. And so, he watched. He followed. He learned. Not a part of their world, but a quiet witness to its wonder. And in doing so, he began to shape his own. It was near the cusp of the cold moons when he first saw himself. Not as shadow, not as dream, but as reflection. He had crouched beside many waters before, to drink, to wash, to listen. The babbling streams, the gliding rivers, the still pools, formed by rain. They had been companions of utility, not mystery. But on one windless evening, beneath the hush of fading twilight, he found a pool unlike the others. It lay within a stone hollow, smooth as if carved by forgotten hands. The water was deep, silent, untouched. No ripple stirred its surface, no leaf marred its face. The forest canopy above framed it in stillness, and he, lean, quiet, weary, approached out of thirst. He knelt, palms pressed to the rock's cold rim, and peered in. And there it was, a face, not a beast's, not the wind's illusion. A face with eyes wide and searching, a brow furrowed in confusion, a mouth that trembled just slightly. Hair hung in tangled strands. Skin bore the stains of soot and the scars of missteps. Lips parted. Eyes blinked, and so did the image. He recoiled. It startled him, the way the water mimicked every motion. The image leaned back when he did, turned as he turned. But unlike the shadow he had long known, this figure had colour, depth, soul. And unlike the stars above, this one looked back. He stared, breath shallow. The pool remained calm. Slowly, he leaned in again. This time he did not flinch. He studied the curve of cheekbone, the wild crown of hair, the strange, sad wisdom in the gaze. The longer he looked, the more the image unsettled him. Not because it frightened him, but because it knew him. It carried the echoes of days he had lived, nights he had whispered into the void. This face had seen the fire, the stars, the hunger. It had wept, and it had sung. It bore no answers, but it remembered. And in that reflection he saw the truth of what he was. Not wolf, not deer, not tree, something else, something that could see itself. That knowing struck him like thunder beneath the skin. His breath caught, and tears welled unbidden in his eyes. He touched his face, and the figure did the same. A hand to cheek, a finger to lip, mirrored sorrow. He whispered, a soft sound with no shape. The image replied with the same. He reached toward the water, fingertips skimming the surface. Ripples bloomed. The image shattered. He gasped. Gone. In a blink, the face dissolved into waves and scatterings. The reflection no longer returned his gaze, just rings expanding outward, as if laughter had broken a spell. He waited, still and patient, for the water to still again. When it did, the face returned. Warped, yes, softer, but there. And he smiled. For the first time, truly and without caution. Because he had met himself, and in that meeting, a seed of understanding bloomed. He had long named things, the stars, the rivers, the fire. But now he realized he had never named this. The creature that walked, that sang, that sought. The being who was both body and story. He pressed his hand to his chest. He named it, not in a language we would know, but in the language of first meaning. A sound that rose from breath and memory and bone. A word shaped not by lips, but by life. And once he had named himself, he whispered it to the pool. The figure whispered it back. There was comfort in that, a sense of circle, of return. Yet even as warmth swelled in him, a new feeling crept in alongside it. Vulnerability. For now, he knew what he looked like. He knew what it meant to be seen, not just by stars or shadows, but by himself. And with that came fear. What if the face changed? What if it faded? What if one day the pool no longer showed him? He sat beside it until night fell, unsure whether to thank it or fear it. The moon cast a pale sheen across the water, and once more the reflection shimmered. Calmer now, more at peace. He whispered again. This time, a story, a short one, about fire and wind and hunger, about walking without echo, about shadows that never turned around. The water listened, and when the story ended, the face still looked back, soft, silent, present. The next day, he returned with stones, small, smooth, carefully chosen. He built a ring around the pool, not to trap it, but to honor it, a sacred edge, a memory's border. And every day that followed, he returned, to speak, to see, to remember. He would watch his own eyes shift with the seasons, his hair lengthen, tangle, grey. He learned to see weariness in his jaw, kindness in his gaze. His reflection aged, yes, but it also deepened. And with each visit, he left a stone by the edge, a marker, not for the world, for himself. A reminder, I was here. I saw myself. I knew that I lived. No other creature did this. No beast sought its own eyes in still water. No bird sang to its reflection. Only he. And so the pool became a place of both peace and reckoning. A mirror not of vanity, but of truth. The place where he remembered who he was, and perhaps, in time, who he could become. They loomed in the distance for what felt like forever. The mountains. Not like the gentle ridges he had climbed in his wandering. Not like the tall hills where trees whispered in the wind. These were older, harsher, and impossibly still, guardians of a world beyond his reach. Each dawn, he saw them silhouetted against the sky, blue-grey and solemn, unmoved by storm or sun. At first, he did not think of approaching them. They seemed too far, too high, too final. They were not part of his walking world. They were part of the background, the dream edge of his vision, permanent, distant, silent. But time and the yearning for something more changed that. He had followed rivers until they thinned into trickles, chased stars until they returned again to their same places. He had wandered forests that echoed his own breath but never his voice, and still the mountains stood. They began to call to him, not with sound, but with stillness. In a world that shifted, danced, and forgot, they endured. He grew weary of places that left no mark. Stones he set in place were tumbled by beasts. Paths he walked were swallowed by wind and rain. But the mountains, he believed they remembered. So one morning, beneath a sky just beginning to warm, he began to walk toward them. It took days, then weeks. The closer he came, the more immense they became. The air grew thinner, crisper. Trees thinned and twisted. The wind sharpened. His legs ached. His breath shortened. But still, he climbed, and with each step, the world grew quieter. Not from lack of sound, but from depth, as if the very earth had turned inward. Birds flew lower. Even his own voice sounded smaller here. The slope rose beneath him, uneven and cruel. Stones shifted. Thorns tore at his legs. Yet a strange fire burned within him. This was not hunger. This was not loneliness. This was purpose. He would reach the unmoving. He would touch the thing that did not flee, did not vanish, did not forget. On the fourth day of climbing, he reached a ledge high above the world. He turned and looked back. The forests he had known were now a blur of green. The rivers, thin silver threads. The horizon curved faintly in the far distance, and clouds drifted below his gaze. He had become for a moment as still as the stone beneath him. And he wept. Not from pain, not from loss, but from perspective. He had never seen the world like this before, from above, from outside. All his walking, his naming, his songs and sorrows. Now they seemed like echoes bouncing inside, a shell he had finally stepped beyond. And yet, the mountains did not praise him. They did not welcome him. They merely were, unchanged, unmoved. He pressed his hand to the stone face of the cliff, cold and ancient. It did not warm. He lay beside it, curled into the crook of a boulder, and dreamed. Not of stars or reflections, but of weight, of things that did not shift when touched, of truths that did not waver. And in that dream, he saw something strange. A line of humans like himself, walking the slopes behind him, each carrying a stone. None of them spoke, but together they were building something high above the world, a place not to conquer, but to remember. He woke with the vision heavy in his chest. That morning, he began to build. Atop the ledge, he stacked stones, not in defense, not in shelter, but in offering. Each stone was chosen carefully, some smooth, some jagged. He balanced them with trembling hands. They fell often. He began again. It was a small cairn, modest, fragile, but it stood. And for the first time in all his days, something he made did not vanish by morning. The wind passed it, the clouds ignored it, the mountain let it be, and he smiled. He added more stones each day, returned again and again to the ledge, sometimes to build, sometimes to sit in silence, sometimes to rest his forehead against the ancient rock and say nothing at all. In time, he began to believe that the mountain was listening, not like the fire or the sky or the stars, but in its own way, by not moving, by staying. It became, to him, a kind of God, not of fear, nor of hunger, nor of stars, but of endurance. The God of things that remain, and he loved it quietly. He sang to it. He carved into its side, not deep enough to wound, but just enough to remember. Spirals, circles, handprints, a language of permanence. For he had learned that there is a beauty in things that change, but there is also a holiness in things that do not. And so, when he left the mountain one day, his hands pressed to the stone one last time. He did not beg it to remember him. He simply nodded, because he knew it would. The dreams began without warning. They crept in softly, as twilight does, quiet and indistinct at first. Not visions of beasts, nor fire, nor the endless woods he knew in waking life, but of something almost familiar, something nearly human. In the dreams, there was a sound, not quite a word, not a cry, but something softer, a voice, not his own. It was not the echo he knew from cliffside hollows, nor the mimicry of the trees when the wind sighed through them. This was different. This voice had shape. It curved, it trembled, it carried emotion. At first, he did not understand it. When he awoke, the dream fell from his mind like morning dew from leaves, impossible to hold. But its warmth lingered in his chest, like a hearth that glowed long after the flame had gone out, and so he began to wait for it. Each night he laid his head upon moss or root with an expectant stillness, hoping to return to the space where the voice lived. And many nights he did. Sometimes it was close, sometimes far, sometimes wrapped in mist, sometimes clearer than the stars. Always it sang. Never in a language, never in anything that could be grasped, but its melody curled around him, gentle as breath, and he felt something he had never felt before. Not just longing, but recognition. He did not know who the voice belonged to. He could not name it, for names required form. The voice had none, but in his dreams, he began to call it the second. A silent label, unspoken even in sleep. It was not his reflection, not a creation of his sorrow. It was an other, and that changed everything. In waking life, he began to notice absences in his silence, places where a voice might have been, a laugh beside the fire, a footstep not his own. He imagined how it would feel to hear something respond, not just to mimic, but to return. So he began to speak more, not to himself, but to the empty air as if someone were truly listening. At the fire, I saw a bird today, red, loud, by the river. The fish move faster when the sky darkens. In the trees. Would you walk this way or that? He even paused to let the silence reply. It never did. But the act itself, making space for another, gave him comfort. He prepared for the voice the way one might prepare for a guest who has not yet arrived, but who is surely on their way. He cleaned his fire pit with care. He wove vines around the edges of his shelter, softening them. He placed flat stones beside his sleeping place, a second bed that might welcome another. He cooked extra roots. He saved the first ripe berry. Always, he offered it to the air before eating. He imagined her, though her was a guess. The voice in the dream carried a gentleness that reminded him of flowing water, of wind threading through high grass. It was not his voice. That much he knew. It was softer, more curious. He imagined how she might move, slowly perhaps, cautious, like a deer, or maybe bold, full of laughter. Would she have eyes like his? Would she weep at stars? Would she fear fire or crave it? These thoughts filled his days. He carved a figure into bark, two shapes side by side, one with a raised hand, one reaching toward it. It was rough, childlike in its simplicity. But when he looked at it, something ached in him like hunger. Not the hunger for food, the hunger for presence. One night, the dream deepened. He was standing in a grove he had never seen, where trees grew in a perfect circle and leaves glowed with silver light. The voice was there, singing just ahead, behind a curtain of mist. He followed it, step by step, heart pounding. The mist parted, and there she was. Her face was hidden, a blur of shadow and light, but her eyes, they were clear, not like his, brighter, wiser, and full of sorrow. She reached for him. Their fingers touched, and then he woke, gasping. The sky above was unchanged. The stars blinked in patient silence. The trees creaked. A firefly pulsed in the dark. But he had changed, because now he believed not in gods, not in magic, but in the possibility of another. It was enough. From that night forward, he left room in his world. He built a second seat beside the fire, always warm. He filled a bowl with water, kept it clear. He smoothed the place beside him when he lay to sleep. He whispered his thoughts into the dark, and in the pause between words, he imagined she answered, not always in sound, sometimes in stillness, sometimes in dream, but always she was there, waiting, like him. And though she had not yet come, he knew, now what he had never dared to hope before. He was not a mistake. He was a beginning. And one day, sooner or later, a second voice would wake. There are sounds in the world that carry meaning, birdsong woven through morning branches, the babble of streams that speak of distance and descent, the rustle of leaves that tells of winds passing. These sounds had become familiar to him. He had grown used to them, trusted them. They announced the world, explained its motion, reassured him that he was still part of its breath. But thunder was different. Thunder had no story. It came without rhythm, without warning, a sudden roar that tore the sky and shook the bones of the earth. It offered no reason, no beginning or end. It simply was, and then it was not, leaving behind a silence thicker than before. The first time he truly listened to thunder, he was nestled beneath the curve of a rock ledge, watching grey clouds swell like bruises above the forest. The air had shifted, dense, electric, too still. Even the birds had fallen silent, their songs swallowed by a waiting hush. And then the sky cracked. It did not call. It did not sing. It split. The sound was not merely loud, it was total. It pressed into him, vibrating in his teeth and chest, like the world itself had spoken a word too large to understand. He flinched, curled tighter beneath the stone. Another strike followed, closer. A jagged thread of light tore down from the clouds and pierced the earth just beyond the hills. A tree there burst into flames. He watched it burn, wide-eyed. Rain came soon after, thick, slanted, impatient. It struck the forest like a scolding. Leaves shivered. Branches groaned. The fire hissed but lived on, stubborn against the wet. He could not move. Not out of fear exactly, but something older. Awe. The kind that roots you to place, forces your breath shallow. It wasn't just the sound. It was the absence of explanation. There was no animal to name, no rhythm to learn, no cause he could see. Thunder was noise without memory, and it frightened him. When the storm passed and the air cleared, he crept from his hiding place, legs stiff, breath cautious. The sky had returned to its blue vastness, as though nothing had happened. The birds resumed their songs, the squirrels resumed their play, even the deer emerged from cover. But he remained unsettled. He walked to the hill where the fire had struck. The tree lay blackened, its branches curled inward like fingers in pain. Smoke curled from its base. He reached out to touch it, then pulled away. The heat lingered. He sat beside it for a long time, watching the sky, and he asked aloud, why? It was not a demand, just a question, simple, bare. The sky did not answer, because thunder, like the mountain, offered no story. It did not arrive with reason or repeat with clarity. It came and it went, taking the world's sense with it. And yet, it was not meaningless. He began to see that. In the days after, he followed the burn path left by lightning. It had cleared a swath through the brush. Old trees had fallen. New light filtered through. Small shoots were already rising from scorched ground. The thunder had not explained itself, but it had changed the world. That realization stuck with him. He began to listen for thunder, not just with fear, but with attention. He tracked the clouds. He noticed how the wind changed before it came, how the light flattened, how silence preceded the strike. And in those patterns he found fragments, not a story, but a presence, something older than speech, something vast and unshaped. He began to think of thunder as a god, not like the fire, not like the mountain, not even like the hunger he once served, but a god of reminder, a being that told him again and again that some things were beyond his understanding, that not all truths would come with answers. He made space for it. When storms gathered, he would find high ground, not to defy it, but to witness. He would sit exposed, arms wrapped around knees, eyes wide, waiting. And when the sky broke, when the roar came and the light struck, he would bow his head and breathe deep. He carved symbols for it, not images of lightning, not pictures of trees or clouds, but jagged lines, broken circles, paths that began and stopped. He painted these on stone with soot and ash, trying to capture the feeling of something that passed too quickly to see. He pressed his palm beside them, marking his own place next to the chaos. Sometimes, when fire followed thunder, he would gather the embers and carry them back to his shelter. He did not claim to own them. He knew they were gifts, fierce, fleeting, dangerous. He treated them with respect. The storms did not come often, but when they did, he no longer cowered. He knelt, not in worship, but in recognition, that even in a world of silence and solitude, there were powers greater than fire, deeper than hunger, older than naming. Powers that did not need to speak to, be understood. One night, during a storm fiercer than any before, he saw lightning strike the far mountain. A bloom of light, a brief silhouette of stone and sky, and for a single instant, the entire world looked known, as if the gods had drawn back a curtain and let him see the shape behind it all. Then it vanished, but the moment remained, long after the thunder rolled away. And so, when he slept that night, curled beside a fire that crackled with storm-born flame, he dreamt not of the second voice, nor of beasts, nor stars. He dreamt of a great open sky and the sound of something too large for words. Pain had always existed. It lived in the thorn that pricked, the stumble on stone, the cold that crept under the skin. But for the first human, those were sensations, not punishments. They were fleeting, dull, without depth. The world offered no language for discomfort, no story for suffering, until one day, pain came not as momentary ache, but as revelation. It began with the simplest act. He was reaching for a sprig of wild root growing between two flat stones near the riverbank. He had bent low, knees cracking softly, one hand steadying, the edge of the rock, while the other slipped into the dark crevice. His fingers brushed the root, firm, ripe, alive, and then a sudden, searing slice along his forearm. The stone had shifted, its edge, honed sharp by centuries of water and wind, sliced deep. The sensation wasn't sharp at first. It was heat, then pressure, then a bloom of something electric that rushed from skin to spine. He jerked back, fell onto his side, and gasped. The wound bled freely, dark red rivulets slipping down his wrist and staining the soil. He stared at it, breath ragged, not with panic, with recognition. This was different. This pain had presence. It wasn't just injury, it was intrusion. The outside world had entered him. The line between self and nature, once blurred, had been crossed, and in that moment, he knew what he had never needed to know before. He could be broken. He pressed his other hand to the wound, but the contact burned. He hissed, a low, wordless cry, and rocked gently, cradling the arm. There was no one to help, no voice to call, only the wind, watching as always, indifferent. It took hours for the bleeding to stop. The sun drifted lower, shadows grew long. He wrapped the arm in leaves, bound it clumsily with twine made from bark, and sat in silence, the throbbing like a second heartbeat. That night, he did not build fire. He could not. Instead, he lay curled beneath a tree, shivering, arm pulsing with pain, the stars above untouched by his suffering. And as the cold pressed in, a thought came to him, not from the wound, but from the space the wound had created. I can end. He whispered it aloud, and once said it would not leave him. His mortality, until now, had been unknown. He had walked boldly, climbed recklessly, eaten freely. But now, pain had shown him a truth deeper than shadow. He was finite. His body, the vessel of all he had ever seen or known, could fail, and with that came a deeper ache. What would happen to his stories, his names, his waiting for the second voice? Would it all simply vanish, unremembered? For days, the wound kept him close to the fire. Movement hurt, climbing was impossible. He stayed within reach of water and rested often. Hunger returned, sharp and steady, but pain kept him cautious. And in stillness, he observed. He saw how birds tended to one another, how wolves, when injured, licked their own wounds and limped behind the pack. He watched a deer with a gash on its leg drink carefully and retreat alone into the trees. No beast cried out for help. None expected rescue. They accepted their wounds. He could not. He did not want to. So he turned his pain into something else. He began to mark it. With soot, he drew the wound on bark, its shape, the blood trailing from it, the leaves he'd used to bind it. He added symbols around it, spirals and lines, things that felt like memory. He placed this carving on the wall beside his shelter. A story. The first story of pain. Not just that it had happened, but that it meant something. He carved more. Old scars from a burn on his foot, a broken fingernail torn months before, a bruise that had darkened after a fall. Each pain received its symbol. Each one was recorded, and for each he made a sound, not a word. He had no words, but a breath, a hum, a low tone, a vocal mark, meant only for him. In doing so, pain became not only a teacher, but a presence, not enemy, not friend, something else. He even began to greet it gently when it returned. He would brush a hand over an old wound and murmur, "There you are," not with joy, with reverence. Because pain, he had learned, was the threshold of memory. It turned moment into story. It shaped caution into wisdom. And it reminded him, again and again, that to be alive was to feel. One night, while staring into the fire, his hand now healed but marked, he closed his eyes and imagined the second voice sitting across from him. He held out his arm, palm upward, revealing the scar. And he whispered, Would you understand this? In his dream, she did. She touched it, then showed her own. A mark along her shoulder, a faded bruise on her side. Two beings who had never met, connected not by language, but by wound, and that dream lingered. Not in sorrow, but in hope, because when pain has a name, and a voice, and a memory, it can also become the beginning of empathy. It was not the first shelter he had built. He had shaped windbreaks from branches, curled beneath tree roots, covered hollows with leaves and bark. He knew how to sleep dry beneath storm, how to angle stones to catch heat, how to drape hides for shade. But this one felt different, because this time he built not from hunger or cold, but from memory. He had returned to a small rise near the still pool, where his reflection had once named him. The place was quiet, sheltered by hills, warmed by morning sun. The soil was soft. The trees offered long limbs, perfect for framing. There were stones here, smooth and flat, easy to stack, and more importantly, there was space. Enough for two. He began the work in silence, day by day, hour by hour, shaping, binding, layering. He wove reeds with more care than ever before. He tested weight against wind. He pressed his palm into the packed earth and whispered sounds of grounding. For every branch he laid, he paused and thought, not about shelter, but about story. But the shelter, though strong, felt empty, not of objects. He had placed stones around the hearth, dried roots on a shelf, even carved figures into the post. It lacked something deeper, something unspoken. It lacked stories, because stories, he had come to realize, are not born from solitude alone. They are kindled in the presence of others. He sat by the fire that night and looked around. The roof was sturdy, the floor was smooth. The second bed, lined with moss, waited, and yet it all felt like a room without echo, a hollow. He picked up one of the carved figures, two stick-like forms joined at the hand, and turned it in his fingers. Its surface was worn smooth. He traced the line where their arms met. Then he set it down between the beds, a placeholder, a symbol. He whispered to it, "When you come, this will be yours." And in that moment, he realized something else. This shelter wasn't only a home, it was a promise. But a promise made in silence can grow heavy. In the days that followed, he wandered less. He stayed near, waiting, tending, listening. He swept leaves from the entry, adjusted stones, smoothed wrinkles in the bark covering. The world outside moved on. Storms gathered and passed. Beasts passed by the hilltop unaware. Seasons edged toward change, and still, he waited. Some nights, he sat on the threshold, legs stretched before him, arms around his knees, staring out into the dusk. He imagined her form, soft-footed, eyes bright, voice warm. He imagined the first moment she would step into the shelter, brush a hand against the wall, and know she had been expected. He imagined the stories they would tell, without words, perhaps, but with gesture, with sound, with firelight and memory. But each morning, the doorway remained untouched. The moss in the second bed lay smooth, and the figure between the beds gathered dust. There were days when doubt crept in, not loud, but persistent. What if no second voice would come? What if the world was not waiting for two? What if this shelter, for all its care, would never be more than walls and roof? He pushed those thoughts aside, and yet, as he sat by the fire one moonless night, he whispered aloud, "What is a story if no one hears it?" The fire crackled, the wood stirred, but no voice answered. The next day, he did something strange. He stood outside the shelter and walked away. Not far, just to the hill's crest. He turned and looked back, and in seeing the shelter from a distance, for the first time, he saw what it truly was. Not a house, a monument. Not to another, but to himself, to his hope, his patience, his will to prepare. A space not for survival, but for sharing. And that, he realized, was a story in itself. He returned with fresh eyes. He added a new carving to the entry post, not of a person, but of an open hand, an invitation. He gathered stones from the river and arranged them into a circle beside the hearth. He hummed a new sound as he worked, not a word, not a tune, but a waiting. And he spoke aloud more often now, not only to the air, but to the shelter itself, to its beams, its walls, its sleeping place. You are not empty, he told it. You are becoming. And something shifted. The wind moved differently through the doorway. The fire burned longer. The moss in the second bed smelled of sun. And though no second voice came, though no figure crossed the threshold, he no longer feared the silence. Because the shelter now carried intention, and that, in the old language of beginnings, was enough to make it sacred. He lay down that night and slept deeply, arms across his chest, breath steady, and in his dreams, she stepped through the doorway. She looked around. She smiled, and she said nothing, for nothing needed to be said. She knew the story. It was already written. There had always been fruit in the forest, small ones nestled in thorny bramble, others dangling like jewels from long-limbed trees. He had tasted them all, bitter, sweet, sour, bland. The earth, in its own quiet rhythm, had fed him, but this one was different. He had never seen it before. It hung from a solitary tree at the crest of a low hill, its trunk bent as if burdened by time, its bark pale and flaking like old bone. The fruit itself glowed softly in the morning sun. Deep, orange, smooth-skinned, heavy with promise. There was only one, just one. He approached slowly. The air around the tree was still, dense with a silence that felt expectant. He reached up, hesitating for the briefest moment, then plucked it. The stem broke with a gentle snap. It was warm in his hand, not just from the sun. It felt alive. He did not eat it right away. Instead, he sat beneath the tree's sparse shade, cradling the fruit like an ember. His fingers traced its curves. His nose inhaled its scent, rich, complex, tinged with something both familiar and utterly new. And a strange thought came to him. This is not mine alone, but there was no one to share it with. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the second voice to appear at last, drawn by the scent, the silence, the wonder of it. The wind stirred the grass. No footstep followed. He held the fruit in his lap and waited. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed. The wind shifted. A bird landed briefly on a nearby branch, chirped twice, and flew away. Still, he waited. At last, with an ache in his chest, he lifted the fruit to his lips and bit. The flavor burst across his tongue, honeyed, soft, threaded with the taste of distant rain and ancient soil. It was unlike anything he had known. It melted as he chewed, leaving behind not residue, but memory. It filled his belly, but left his heart hollow. He finished the fruit slowly, each bite smaller than the last. He tried to savor it, to stretch it out as if that would somehow undo what had already happened. But the fruit was gone, and no one else had tasted it. He stood and looked at the tree again. The branches were still. No new fruit, no hidden twin. The gift had been singular, and he had eaten it alone. He buried the pit nearby, pressing it gently into soft soil, covering it with leaves, and whispering something he did not understand. A wish, a regret, a seed, not just of the tree, but of something deeper. For the first time in his life, he did not hunger for food. He hungered for witness. The joy he had tasted meant less because no one else had seen it. No one had watched his eyes widen. No one had smiled at his delight. No voice had joined his in that first surprised breath, and so the sweetness turned bitter. That night, he dreamed of a grove. In the dream, the tree had bloomed again. But now, it bore many fruits, round and glowing, and from the forest came figures, like himself, drawn by the light, each with open hands, each with wondering eyes. They reached for the fruit together. They bit together. They shared. He awoke with tears on his cheeks and dirt beneath his nails, as though he had clawed at the ground in sleep, searching for something that could not be found. The days that followed were quiet. He moved through the forest with less urgency, eating only when needed, gathering roots and berries with method, not joy. He visited the tree often. It remained bare, no fruit, but the soil around it was soft. He knelt there daily, watering the earth with cupped hands, clearing leaves, keeping it warm at night with dried moss. He spoke to the buried pit. "Grow," he said. "Not for me, for us." The us was fragile, but it mattered. He began to understand that joy, like shelter and fire and story, was not whole unless shared. A thing tasted alone was only half remembered. A delight unspoken faded like mist. So he prepared. Next to the tree, he placed a flat stone carved with the spiral he had come to use for memory. He left a bowl of water nearby. He braided grasses into 2 circles, setting them side by side. Offerings, not to a god, to a future. And one evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the world in gold, he returned to the spot and found something new. A sprout, thin, green, trembling, but alive. He knelt before it, breath held, and smiled. It would take time. Moons. Years. Perhaps he would not see its fruit again, but someone might. And maybe, just maybe, they would not be alone when they tasted it. Maybe they would sit where he sat, laugh where he had cried, and say to another, "Taste this." And in that moment, a story would be born. Not of a fruit eaten, but of a fruit shared, and that story would live longer than any hunger. The earth was generous with space, but stingy with memory. The first human had wandered countless days beneath the ever-turning sky, leaving trails across valleys and ridges, along riverbanks and forest floors. Yet everywhere he returned, the world had forgotten him. Footprints, those delicate declarations of presence, were always the first to vanish. At first, he thought little of it. He stepped, moved, passed. The earth accepted the weight of his feet without question. Mud took his shape. Sand shifted around his toes. Grass bent beneath his steps. But nothing stayed. Time and wind were erasers. Rain was a gentle thief. By morning, the trail of the day before had always faded, and with it, a piece of him. He began to take notice. On a quiet afternoon after days of windless weather, he walked through a bed of powdery ash left from a long-cooled fire. His steps left perfect impressions, deep, smooth, curved like small bowls. He turned to admire them, felt something stir in his chest, a strange pride. They were not just marks. They were proof. I have passed here. But when he returned the next day, the prints were gone. A breeze had risen overnight and carried them into the trees. The ash was smooth again, undisturbed. It was as though he had never walked at all. He knelt, tracing his fingers across the dust, searching for the ghost of his step. Nothing. The world had restored itself. Or perhaps simply continued, unbothered by memory, and that frightened him. If the ground did not remember him, who would? He began to test it. He stepped in wet clay and watched the print form. He counted the hours. By dusk, a falling leaf had landed across the heel. By morning, the river had risen and taken it entirely. He walked in snow, briefly. His trail curved through a silent glade. He paused to admire it, then moved on. When he returned, The wind had stirred, and fresh flakes had fallen. The prince were buried, muted beneath a new silence. Not even snow would keep him. It made him feel light, too light, like a shadow untethered, not because he lacked form, but because he left no weight behind. He tried building instead. Circles of stones, small cairns, charred wood arranged in star shapes. But time found these too. Animals knocked them down. Rain scattered ash. The trees dropped leaves in drifts that covered even his best efforts. The forest, generous and immense, was also forgetful, and he began to ask a terrible question. Is it possible to walk the world and leave nothing behind? He whispered it aloud one evening, sitting by the fire. The flames answered only in crackles. So he spoke again to the stars. Do you see me? When I am gone, will you remember my steps? The stars did not blink in response, and yet he did not give up. Instead, he changed his walk. He began to move with care, with pattern. Not just wandering, but tracing. He returned again and again to the same places. A trail formed, not from prints, but from practice. Leaves wore thinner, earth pressed firmer. The path shaped itself, and though no single print remained, the route began to remember him. It curled around the pool where he had seen his reflection, passed beneath the tree that bore the fruit he once ate alone, twisted through the grove near the shelter, rose briefly over a ridge from which the sun could be seen setting whole. He did not mark it with tools. He marked it with time. Each day, he walked it. Each morning, the same bend of knee. Each evening, the same return. And slowly, it became a story not of one step, but of many. Not of presence, but of repetition. He learned then that some things vanish not because they are weak, but because they are singular. A single footprint fades, but many footsteps become a path. And a path, even unmarked, changes the land. Birds began to perch along the trail. A fox followed it once, sniffing where his scent had lingered. Even the grass began to bend more easily where he passed, as though learning the shape of his motion. He no longer feared the vanishing. Instead, he embraced the rhythm. He would walk, and the earth would forget. He would walk again, and the earth would remember. Not with sight, not with voice, but with curve, with wear, with pattern. And perhaps one day, when the second voice arrived, she would find this path beneath her feet and pause. She would look down and think, someone walked here before me, and she would follow, and she would add her own steps. And together, their path would deepen, even if the earth forgot their names. It would know their shape, and that, he decided, was enough. So each day he walked, a quiet pilgrimage, a soft engraving of soul on soil, and though his prints vanished behind him, he left something deeper beneath, something the wind could not erase. In the heart of a quiet glade, surrounded by songbirds and wind-swept branches, stood a tree that had forgotten how to sing. The first human discovered it near dusk, when the light was long and golden, and shadows stretched like soft threads across the forest floor. He had wandered far that day, deeper than usual, in search of nothing in particular. The air was cool, filled with the fading sounds of day's end, crickets warming their legs, owls rousing from sleep, leaves hissing in preparation for night. And then he entered the glade. Everything fell silent. The hush was immediate, unnerving. It was not the stillness of calm, but of pause, like a breath held too long. At the center stood a tree unlike the others. Not because of its shape. It was tall, with strong limbs, a wide canopy. Not because of color. Its bark was rich and brown, its leaves deep green. But because of its silence, it made no sound. No creak as the wind passed through it, no flutter of leaves, no rustle at its base. It stood as though the world had forgotten it. or worse, as though it had forgotten the world. He approached slowly, one bare foot after the other, listening, but still nothing. He pressed his palm to its bark, cool, unyielding. The texture was smooth in places, rough in others, but it gave no sign of life, not in sap, not in scent, not in sound. He listened harder. He even leaned close, ear to trunk, hoping to hear the groan of wood bending with breath or the whisper of wind dancing through its limbs. But there was nothing, no song, not even silence, with depth, only absence, and it filled him with a strange, unsettled grief. For he had come to learn, through long moons of solitude, that everything had its music. The fire sang in crackle and hiss, the river hummed, the stones vibrated faintly, under pressure. Even the stars, in their own way, pulsed with a rhythm that could be felt, if not heard. But not this tree. This tree stood outside all rhythm. He sat at its base, wrapped his arms around his knees, and stared upward through its canopy. The leaves caught the sun's last rays, but didn't shimmer. They hung as if waiting, but for what, he could not tell. He reached into his own chest, into the language he had built from memory and murmur, and sang to it, a soft, rising sound, wordless, woven from longing. He waited. There was no echo. He sang, again, louder, still, nothing. A third time, this time with desperation, pouring into his voice the ache of moons without answer, the hunger for presence, the sting of unshared stories. But the tree gave no reply. He placed his hand once more on the bark and whispered, "Why won't you speak?" But deep down, he knew the truth. Some things do not speak because they were never taught how. And perhaps, just perhaps, some things choose silence, not from lack, but from sorrow. He looked around the glade. The forest around it was alive. Birds in the canopy, insects in the brush, breezes that danced among the leaves. Yet none came close to this tree. It was like an island, a wound, a monument to something lost. He stood and circled the trunk. He found no nests in its branches, no scratches from claw or tooth, no fungus growing at the base. Nothing lived on it. Nothing lived within it. It was beautiful and utterly alone, like him. He returned to it the next day, and the next. He began to bring it offerings, a feather, a berry, a flat stone. He laid them at its roots, not to awaken it, but to acknowledge it. "I hear your silence," he said. And over time, he began to wonder, what if the tree's silence is its way of surviving? What if it had once sung, long ago, and no one had listened? What if its songs had gone unanswered for so long, it had closed its voice like a wound? He thought of himself, of the early moons, of crying out to stars and wind and beasts, only to be met with silence, and he understood. Perhaps this tree was not mute, perhaps it was hurt, and perhaps, like all living things, it needed not answers, but companionship. So he stayed. He visited it at dawn, greeted it softly. He sang beneath it, not for reply, but for company. He carved no mark, left no wound. He simply was beside it. Until, one morning, when the mist was thick and the world still grey, he heard it. A leaf fell. Not loudly, just a whisper, a sigh. He looked up. One branch trembled, not from wind, but from release. Another leaf drifted down, then another, a gentle rain of gold and green. And in that moment he realized the tree was singing, not in notes, but in gesture, in shedding, in the slow, sacred act of letting go. It had heard him, not through sound, but through presence. And now it was answering in its own time, its own language. He smiled, opened his arms, and let the leaves fall around him. And for the first time, in that quiet, empty glade, there was a song. Not his, not the world's, but the trees soft-earned and everlasting. He did not mean to invent her. She arrived slowly, not in a flash of vision or a sudden sound, but in the long pauses between thoughts, an outline at the edge of the firelight, a presence in the space where silence curled too tightly. At first, it was a glance over the shoulder at nothing, a whisper offered to the air. But then he began to expect her. She had no name, no face, but she was. And in her being, however unreal, he found comfort. It began one night as he sat beside the hearth, watching the flames dance low. The wind outside hissed in the trees. The stars above blinked in sleepy rhythm. His body ached with weariness, but he did not yet wish to sleep. He sighed aloud and said, "You would have liked this fire." And the moment the words left him, a ripple passed through the world. Not because someone answered, but because for the first time, the absence of answer felt like a kind of presence. She was not real. He knew that, yet he could see her clearly. Now seated across from him, knees drawn up like his, hands outstretched to the flame. She smiled gently. She said nothing, but he felt her watching. He began to speak to her each evening, sometimes about the day, the shape of the clouds, the way the birds moved. Sometimes about the ache in his bones, the taste of a new root. And sometimes he simply hummed, letting the sounds fill the space between them like shared breath. He gave her no name, but he gave her story. She had wandered, like him. She had tasted silence, feared storms, dreamt of the stars. He imagined her younger than he, but wise in different ways. She was gentler. She would not wound a tree to mark it. She listened more than she spoke, and somehow, though he made her, she surprised him. One evening, while chewing a bitter root, he laughed softly and muttered, "You would have spat this out." And in his mind, she wrinkled her nose and did just that, tossing the root aside with mock disgust. He laughed again. For a moment, it felt like they shared it, a joke, the first in his long and lonely memory. She became a constant shadow, not always, near, but always returning. She watched as he added new stones to the fire circle. She sat with him at the river's edge. She stood beside him beneath the tree that sang no songs. He imagined her voice often, not what it sounded like, but what it might say, not in words, but in questions. Are you tired? Does it still hurt? Will you ever stop walking? He answered aloud, not because he believed, but because pretending filled the space between footsteps with something soft. He knew she was not real, but the world, wide as it was, did not argue. It made room for her. And in that allowance, she began to feel more than memory, more than invention. She became ritual. He saved her the sweeter berries. He smoothed a space in the moss beside him. He carved small trinkets and left them where her hand might find them. It did not matter that she had no hand. It mattered that he believed she did. And then, one morning, he found her bones. They lay not far from the fruit tree, half buried in the moss, small, weathered, cradled by roots. They were not hers, of course. They belonged to some long-dead creature, a deer perhaps, or a small tree dweller. But in the shape of the bones, in their gentle curve, he saw her, and something inside him trembled. He knelt and brushed the soil gently away. Each rib, each joint, each delicate fragment, he lifted them with reverence, as though she had once laughed here, once wept here, once sat beside him as the wind moved through their shared world. He laid them in a circle. He placed a stone in the center, and for the first time in all his moons of wandering, he wept, not with despair, but with gratitude, because somehow, in a life without others, he had made room for companionship, even if it had been born from longing, even if it was only ever imagined. He wept for the beauty of that creation, and for its loss. Because now, with bones beneath his hands, she felt gone. He sat there long into the evening, the fire burning low, the bones glowing faintly in the ember's light. He whispered, "You were real enough for me," and in the hush that followed, a breeze stirred the leaves, soft as breath. She did not return after that. Not in the same way. He still imagined her now and then, still caught her laughter in the rustle of branches or her silence in the stillness of the fire. But he no longer needed her beside him, because what she had taught, the ache of longing, the beauty of invention, the gift of pretending someone could care, had already woven itself into his bones. He had made a friend from nothing and, in doing so, had remembered how to feel. There is a silence that echoes more deeply than sound, and in that silence, one can begin to hear things that never truly speak. He had wandered into a chasm where stone walls leaned close together, forming a narrow throat of the earth. The sky above was little more than a blue ribbon winding overhead. The sun, though bright outside, barely touched the floor of this place. He had gone there not for shelter, but for something older than that. Clarity, a silence deeper than trees, deeper than caves. A silence not born of distance, but of weight, and the chasm gave it to him. At first, it was peaceful. No wind, no animals, no dripping water. He could hear his own breath echo faintly from the stone, and that, in itself, was enough. He sat against the wall, his hands resting on cool rock, and spoke aloud. "It is a quiet day." He meant nothing by it, but the voice returned, softer, slower. "It is," and then not silence. A pause. Then not day. He blinked. The echo had broken pattern. He tried again. "I am alone." The reply came back, almost faithful. "I am," but instead of completing the sentence, it added something new. "Not alone." He stood quickly, scanning the shadows. No one. No wind. No shifting. He crouched low, hand to earth, searching for vibration. Nothing. Just the stone. Just the voice. Just the echo that wasn't. It unnerved him. Not because it spoke back, but because it spoke otherwise. It contradicted, and contradictions in solitude are dangerous things. He waited in stillness, then tried again, calmly. "Are you my echo?" There was a long pause, then softly, "Am you?" Not yes, not no, not "I am your echo," but something far stranger. "Am you?" As if the voice did not just reflect him, it believed itself to be him, or, worse, to be something he had forgotten. He stood, raised his voice, sharply now. "Why do you speak when I do not?" And from far across the chasm, the voice answered, in perfect cold clarity, "Because you need me to." It chilled him, not from malice, but from accuracy. He did need it. He had spoken to fire, to water, to stars, to trees. He had made a friend from dreams and buried her with bones not her own. He had sung to silence until it shaped itself in return, and now he faced something that did not wait for permission, something that chose to speak. He said nothing more that day, not out of fear, but out of caution. He left the chasm slowly, never turning his back, listening for footsteps that were only ever his. But in the days that followed, the voice stayed with him, not aloud, not even in memory, but in hesitation, in doubt. He began to question the sound of his own thoughts. When he hummed, he wondered, was that mine? When he whispered in sleep and awoke to hear an answering breath, he asked, was I still dreaming? And worst of all, when he spoke of her, the one he had imagined, he wondered now if she had ever been silent, or if something had always been answering from the dark, in borrowed tone. He returned to the chasm only once more, just before nightfall. He stood in its throat and said nothing. He waited for a sound, for a slip, for proof that the voice was still listening. The wind did not stir. No answer came, and yet, as he turned to go, a voice, his voice, but not, whispered just behind him. She waits for you. He did not run, but he did not return again. The voice had lied, not because it wanted to deceive, but because he needed to believe. And that, he now understood, was the most dangerous kind of echo, the kind that says only what you long to hear. The dream did not begin with a face. It began with breath, a soft exhale, close, too close for wind, too warm for memory. Then came movement, a shift in weight beside him, the light rustle of skin against earth, as if the silence itself had stirred, to lie down near his own sleeping form. He did not wake, not fully, but his dreaming mind leaned toward it, curious, reaching, afraid to grasp too tightly in case the moment shattered. She was not shaped yet. She was outline, shadow, rhythm, the echo of a life that might one day be. In the dream, she did not speak, and yet he knew her, not by name, for he had never learned to name others, not by history, for there had never been a before, but by intention. She looked at him, though he could not see her eyes, and in that gaze he felt seen, felt known, not as a creature alone and singular, but as one half of a waiting whole. He reached for her and woke. The fire had long since faded. The stars above were dimming, the sky at the edge of silver. Cold clung to his skin, but in his hand, nothing. Only dirt. Only the impression of reaching. And yet the warmth lingered, not in his fingers, but in his chest. A hush bloomed within him, as if the world had paused, watching to see what he would do with this fragile vision. For a long time, he did nothing. He sat in stillness and let the dawn unfurl. Then, slowly, he rose. He walked the path to the pool, where his reflection waited. But this time, he did not look at his own face. He knelt and whispered, "What would yours look like?" The water rippled, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, there was a second face beside his, not formed, not clear, but present. He wept, not because he was sad, but because he realized something had changed. He no longer wanted to be the first. He wanted to be followed. He returned to his shelter and began again, not to rebuild, but to prepare. He cleared a second sleeping place, opposite his own. He fashioned a small seat from stone. He gathered 2 of everything, 2 bowls, 2 mantles, 2 bundles of dry root for tea. And in the evenings, he no longer hummed for himself alone. He sang as though someone else was listening, not near, not yet, but coming, and perhaps that was enough. He began to teach the world how to greet her. He carved lines into the bark of trees, simple marks that meant nothing yet, but might one day be understood. He left stones in spirals near the river's bend. He pressed shapes into soft clay, his hand, and beside it, another smaller impression. Not his, but hers. The dream had returned many times now, and each time she drew closer. One night, she touched his shoulder. One night, she laughed, a sound like wind chimes in distant air. He had never heard laughter before that, not truly, but now he knew it, and he longed to hear it again, awake. He told the fire stories he imagined she would like. He asked the moon if she watched from somewhere else, and he listened, always, for the sound of another pair of feet. It never came, and yet, he was not discouraged, because the dream had given him a gift greater than certainty. It had given him readiness. It had shifted his solitude from wait to welcome. No longer did he walk only to survive. Now he walked to explore, for 2. He tasted roots and imagined her face, reacting to bitterness or sweetness. He held strange stones and wondered what names she would give them. He watched the sky and asked it quietly, "What will she think of the stars?" The silence was kind, patient. The world made space beside him. One morning, as he sat by the pool, he whispered, "If you find me, I will know you." And the wind moved through the grass in answer, not confirmation, but acknowledgement, and that was enough. He rose, looked toward the east, and smiled, because one does not need to see the second human to believe in her. One only needs to make room, and he had.